I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the Mosaic of Wine Series 2, connecting you to some of the most interesting, successful, and influential people working in and around wine. We continue the series today in the company of Jasper Morris, Master of Wine. Nowadays, Jasper is synonymous with Burgundy, living and working there, and now best known for his book Inside Burgundy and the website of the same name. However, it wasn't always so, and as recently as the 1980s, the demand for Burgundy hadn't yet been established. Today, we take a virtual journey through those early days via the people influencers, perhaps most notably Tony Verdin, with whom Jasper founded Morris and Verdin, and Becky Wasserman. We explore the changing culture in Burgundy at the time, the rise of Primeur, changes in consumer demand, told through the lens of his time at Morris and Verdin, before he sold the company and joined Berry Brothers and Rudd, and finally as an independent consultant. A journey inside Burgundy in the company of Jasper Morris. Enjoy.
I obviously owe a lot of thanks to quite a few different people, as everybody must when they're starting out. And of course, I was starting out in wine, which is not something that our family had previously done. We didn't really drink wine at home. Mm-hmm. But my elder sister, Arabella Woodrow, she got interested in wine while at university. And in fact, she stayed on and did a second degree, and her second degree overlapped with my first degree, and she sort of rather bullied me. You don't necessarily want to do what your older sister tells you to do, but she got me involved in the wine tasting scene there. So she would have been the first influence. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And also, while at university, as I got involved in the wine circle there, there's a chap called Tony Verdin who had a business in Oxford. He had Charwell Boathouse Restaurant, in fact, amongst other sorts of business. And I got to know him, and then he said, maybe we should start a business when you leave university. And I knew that I didn't want to do any of the sort of more obvious professional things like becoming a banker or accountant or lawyer. Our family normally have been lawyers and so on. And so this seemed to be a good opportunity. And then I also managed to find myself a job in a new startup retail business in London, which is called Burley and Goodhouse, of whom the Burley was Mark Burley, who owned Annabelle's nightclub, and Johnny Goodhouse is still, he's 10 years my senior, but he's still running his wine business even now. So that was the start.
I love it. And I think it's also worth reflecting, a little bit on your degree, because I understand that actually that interest there does still support and come out in some of the work that you do even to this day.
Yes. So I read what's called modern history, but I managed to do most of it before 1485, before America gets invented and so on, which I found more stimulating because there's a lot less source information. So it's a question of putting the facts in order and working out conclusions and learning how to make decisions, really, which has been useful. But one of the periods that I studied was medieval Burgundy. Well, France and Burgundy, but of course, in the later part of the Hundred Years' War, the Burgundians were the allies of the English against the French. They gave us Joan of Arc to taste and so on. So when later on I discovered Burgundy, it was lovely to have that in the background.
Yeah. It's again, it's I think all of these. Well, I think history. I think history is certainly something that wine regions. Yeah, I think some of them do. I think do a better job of positioning that and making sure that that's part of their story. And I think if you think Burgundy, I think it's difficult to kind of separate that from the history of the monks and just the history of winemaking in the region and kind of how far back that goes. And
yes, and if you go to Beaune or to Dijon, but I'm thinking especially of Beaune with the Hôtel Dieu, which was created in the 15th century and is a magnificent building, and you still get some wonderful bits of art in it as well, and you still get that feeling of the original times that have led to what we have today.
Amazing. I do, I know we'll end up in Burgundy, I'm sure, because I know that's where you're based now, and that's where you're speaking from today. But I would also just, I think love to, give your story. I think it's credit as well, and kind of credit you with your place. I think the really interesting time that you found yourself really in the evolution of not only the wine trade but also the evolution of Burgundy. So maybe take us a little bit deeper into that initial experience after university.
And it's something I think about today when people want advice starting out. But nowadays, you could, if you decided you like wine, you could start out learning how to make it and be a winemaker or something else. But at the time that I was doing it, everybody was sort of being shoehorned into standard fits, if you like. And to join the wine trade, it used to be said that the first son would inherit, the second would join the army, and the third would join the church if intelligent, or become a wine merchant if not intelligent. Anyway, so I've ended up on the wine merchant side of things. But in that first job at Burley & Goodhouse, we had a wine consultant who was called Harry Waugh, who's a really extraordinary man. So he was born right at the beginning of the 20th century and lived through to the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he taught me a great deal. He wasn't hugely intense and super complicated, but he was just somebody who had everything lined up in the right way. He had a natural sense of integrity. He retained a huge enthusiasm for wine right up to the end of his life. He trained a lot of the early MWs who developed probably greater fame than he did, people like Michael Broadbent or David Peppercorn, Serena Sutcliffe and so on. We didn't train Serena, but that generation of older masters of wine were really helpful to me to begin with, and Harry was sort of a mentor, and I learned a great deal from him. And in particular, though he had been a director of Chateau Latour, and Bordeaux was the origins of his career in wine, he was beginning to get much more involved in Burgundy later on. But it wasn't him who really pushed me in that direction. It was this incredible lady called Becky Wasserman. And in fact, I now live next door to her property. She sold me a bit of her property in the 1990s. But back in 1981, she had just started her business selling domain bottled Burgundy, mostly to the American market. And somebody had given me a lead to her, and I met her and absolutely, got on so well right from the start. And the first appointments that she sent me to were domains like Domaine des Comtes Lafont and Domaine Costurie, and really top of the tree names who didn't have agents in the UK at that point. It was really absolutely at the start of this business of domain bottled Burgundy, which we now absolutely take for granted, but it wasn't the case 40-some years ago. I think it was 1981, at the end of our first year of trading as Morris and Verdin, company I set up with Tony Verdin, that I came to Burgundy, and wow, what a revelation.
And again, it's always amazing to hear these reflections, because again, we're not going back so far. It's within my lifetime, and it's within, I'm sure, a lot of the lifetime of the listeners. And give us a sense, though. You're saying domain bottled Burgundy was kind of a new thing there. What was the sort of conversation that was being had then? When you, of course, you went to Burgundy. I think that the words you used was, you realized, and you had this sense, this intuition that you were in the right place at the right time.
Yes, very
much.
So.
But then you were then, I guess, without the internet and without social media, you were really then the custodian, of course, of the wine, but then also of the story, of the history.
Yes. So Burgundy in those days would have been sold into the UK from a series of shippers, they're often called, but we would call them négociant houses now, so merchants, of which the best known and the best were people like Drouin and Louis Jadot, Faverly, Louis Latour was very well represented in the UK. And then there was another string of perhaps second division merchant houses, and just a very, very few domains, even Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. It was being shipped, but they didn't have a London-based importer, and that only changed in the early 80s. So it was a complete start, and we were just beginning to hear about one or two. I can't clearly remember, in fact, how much I would have known before then, because Becky introduced me to them. Was I even really conscious of the existence of them before then? Possibly not, or not very much. And so, yes, so off I went round these now we think of as completely incredible, utterly wonderful producers. And what I loved about it was their enthusiasm for their wines in a way that I hadn't really seen travelling elsewhere in France. Bordeaux was very much commercially minded. The Rhône and the Loire, they were people who were agricultural farmers, if you like, whose crop happened to be grapes, and they turned them into wine, and they're very proud of their wines. And they would talk about different vineyards, but they'd sort of come stumping in from the vineyards, open up a few bottles for me, asked if I liked them. If I wanted to buy, I usually could, and off I'd go. But when I came to Burgundy, there was just this feeling of wonder and fascination, not just from me, but I sensed it in the producers themselves.
And in a sense of that kind of wonder that was coming from them, that was kind of something that had just sort of always been there, and again was maybe
it was
in the air.
I think it was largely a new generation starting. Some ways it's a bit tricky to talk about a new generation, because in a region where you've got several thousand producers, obviously lots of domains are going to change hands every year. But there was a key group in the sort of well-off middle-class families, if you like, whose parents had domains, and they may or may not have been bottling their own wines. They probably weren't necessarily doing this work out in the vineyards. But then this group of whom, my big mate is Dominique Lafont, but it wasn't just him. Dominique Lefort, Patrick Bies, Domaine Simon Bies, Christophe Roumier, Etienne Cuivaux, and Claude Leflèvre is about the same generation.
Mm-hmm.
I've left plenty of them out, but
Sure.
But that's an indication. They were getting more involved, I think, than their parents ever had. They were the first generation where they all went to wine school. They're the first generation that started tasting in each other's cellars. And that really was, I think, a key part of the transformation. So suddenly there are a whole load of them that actually one I'll mention because he's not one of the super famous names, but Patrice Rion took over at Domaine Daniel Rion. I think 79 was the first vintage where they really bottled a lot. I went and tasted on my second trip to Burgundy and tasted the last of the 79s and the 90s. 1980 was not a great vintage officially. Louis Latour had decried it and said it was, without exception, not worth buying, which didn't go down well with his colleagues in Burgundy. But I tasted the Rion 1980s and I was just absolutely knocked sideways that the wines could be as good as this, as consistent as this. So he also we should count him in as part of that generation, but he wasn't sort of one of that group, if you like, of buddies. But that domain has gone on making super wine ever since.
I love it. And this is where I think the conversation has, naturally led into culture, because, I can sense it now, as you kind of reflect that, again, this was really a special time, that it obviously was very influential on you. I think, Becky was obviously, influential not only on yourself, but on, I think on probably hundreds of other wine professionals and wine lovers around the world. Yeah.
Wine professionals of all dimensions, wine writers, wine importers, winemakers. And she had the respect, even though what she was doing was commercially sort of not in the interests of the big houses. I know that she absolutely had the respect of the key players amongst the negociants. So I don't think there was an issue there. And so we had the chance to do something in the UK that wasn't happening before. Now, we weren't alone in that. There was a company called Domaine Direct, a lady called Hilary Gibbs. There was Anthony Hansen's company, Haynes, Hansen and Clark. There was Richards Wolford, there was Bibendum. So 4, 5, 6 companies, and apologies if I've left anybody else out, who all picked up on this Burgundy movement at the same time. But for whatever reason, we got the most of the plaudits for it. The International Wine Challenge, we were voted to the Burgundy Specialist of the Year for several years in a row. So, that really helped it happen for us. And our company initially had meant to work with just French wines, but from all over France. And steadily, Burgundy began to take on the key position. Plus, we did move outside France as well, particularly starting with California, because Becky gave me a glass of Pinot Noir, which I thought, very young, obviously, just been bottled 1980, early 87 as well, so it would have been 1985. I thought maybe it was Michel Lafarge's Volnay, and it turned out to be Au Bon Climat Pinot Noir. So I decided, in the right place at the right time, but decided to pick up the challenge. And so we started shipping those wines made by an incredible character called Jim Clendenin, and that developed a whole load of other Californian wineries. And then we also did that in some other countries as well.
Yeah, no, I love it. And again, these reflections, and I think it's great. You've got the ages there. I mean, again, that's less than 40 years ago. It's really the blink of an eye. I think in a historical sense, and just in a cultural sense. But yeah, I think this would be great, as you've naturally sort of moved us along in the story there. I think it would be great to just kind of pick up really a sense of all of this that's happening at the same time. As you say, it's not just yourselves. There's a thirst, I guess, that's been opened up within the consumer.
The thirst wasn't there yet. It was a real struggle to sell the wines, and I was young. I started the business age 23. A bit naive, full of exuberance, but that can also mean that you start picking up on suppliers who aren't in fact in the top class, because you just get excited by the whole thing. And we had one or two that I look back on now and thought, oops, possibly shouldn't have done those. But we also had some really great names. But right through, it wouldn't have been till the middle of the 90s that we began to see a real interest in Burgundy. And we were fortunate in the UK that we came out of the sort of 93, 94 really deep recession before continental Europe did, which meant that when a couple of pretty good vintages, 95 and 96, came along, they were certainly a lot better than 94 and 2 or 3 other recent vintages before them. And so we thought, right, we can sell these. And the pound for once got stronger and European currencies were weaker. So I was getting a much better exchange rate. we were sort of obliged to take a bigger margin because I didn't feel we could sell a vintage as good as 96 more cheaply than the ones that had gone before. So we sold them at the same price and took some extra. And that was really a boom period. And people were now getting excited about it. But everything was still happening in the old-fashioned way that you would wait for whichever wine merchant, or maybe two or three if you're really into wine, you'd wait for their catalogues to come in through your letterbox and you'd study them for a while. And then you get in touch and say, oh, I think maybe I'll take a dozen of that, and so on and so forth. It was all very, very gentle in those days. And so for a few years, we actually had an equilibrium between supply and demand. So I have to say I enjoyed those years. It was after 2000 that things began to change, particularly around 2005-06. With the arrival of 2005 vintage, which is such a wonderful vintage, and also the fact that now people were communicating electronically. Which meant that price lists were sent out electronically, and fairly soon you got websites which put the prices of the wines on, and then and so on and so forth, and suddenly everybody could see the prices of everything. It also was a period in which merchants began to put on tastings of the very young wines for their customers, which has been a little bit of a double-edged sword in some ways, because it is quite a different job to taste a very young wine and be able to work out where it's going to go, compared to having a good natural palate and being able to taste a wine and say, that's good, that's less good. But to taste something that's really young when it still has acidity and tannin and all these things which are crucial to the structure of the wine, but actually ugly to taste. I think this may have come up with one of your other talks, maybe with Barbara, about the words to use. And Becky was really strong on this. She said, we have to redefine our vocabulary, because all these words we use, they're actually turn-offs to normal human beings. And yes, absolutely. It's something I do sometimes when talking about wine with people. And if we're tasting wine that's a little bit too young, I say, okay, I want you to taste this wine two ways. First of all, do what you would normally do if you're at home drinking your wine, pick up the glass, put it in your mouth, swallow it, and think, oh, that's nice. And now I'd like you to taste it like a professional taster, which is you put some into your mouth, you draw the air through, you swirl it around your mouth, you chew on it, and you get all the structural parts going to different parts of your mouth. And frankly, that's a much less pleasant thing to do. I mean, tannins are not pleasant. Acidity is not in itself pleasant. It's essential to have as part of the balancing act. So lots of people were now coming along to these sort of en primeur style tastings. We did one from way back in March, but then January became the month for Burgundy and all the merchants moved to January. And it's an amazing opportunity because it means an enthusiast can spend a week going to up to 3 tastings a day, probably more of those are actually available, and taste so many different things and really get a handle on it. But nonetheless, it's a very difficult thing to do when you're tasting something that possibly hasn't even been bottled yet and maybe 20 years away from its ideal drinking moment.
Yeah, I still remember really, Jasper, in the early days of the podcast. I think it was sort of, episode 80 something. It seems to ring a bell. I remember there was a Burgundy Week panel that was part of the podcast, and I remember that was sort of my first introduction to the whole en primeur series of tastings, let's say. And I think it would be, I think, because I wouldn't claim to be able, I've been to, again, my fair share of en primeur tastings. I wouldn't claim to be able to accurately be able to predict, what is going to be delicious, 10, 15 years down the track. And I'm just curious then, do you think that actually then laid another element over it? Because presumably it was brought in because then there really was that competition, and it was a question of, okay, we need to, if we're going to buy this wine, then we need to put in our orders earlier than perhaps we were previously.
Yes, it became all part of the whole build-up, the sort of pageantry almost of selling your Burgundy. And actually the growers themselves rather love it because many of them work with more than one importer. So they come over for the week, they do 3 or 4 different tastings. They would get to taste all their colleagues' wines because even though people do go and taste in other cellars now, it tends to be within defined groups. And there was even one leading French critic, the leading French critic, Michel Bertin, who would come to London and to taste his Burgundies and said, it's far easier. I can taste several hundred different producers all in 1 week, all in a couple of square miles. So yes, but there's a fair amount of organising goes into that, and the wines don't necessarily show as well. It depends when you get your samples prepared and so on and so forth. And making very young wine that hasn't been bottled yet, travel isn't ideal. But no, it was a necessary part of, and still is, of the Burgundy sales machine. And what's been really useful for Burgundy is to have that one moment in the year, at least for UK customers, but then it does spread a little bit into other markets, when everybody focuses on it and you really decide what you're going to sell from the point of view of the merchant and or as the private customer, what we're going to buy. And I think that has been significant bonus in getting Burgundy sold in recent years.
Let's again, this is great to kind of get that snapshot and almost just have our own perceptions challenged, I think, and certainly have my perception challenged of, has this institution sort of, or has this occasion always existed? No, it hasn't. It's like, there
Indeed,
was a time.
We do take things for granted, and always it depends on where you come into the story. And when as people get older, then they start questioning, things are changing, but it depends on where your baseline was. And certainly it's something for me, and again, this is something I would have learned from Becky in particular, is that you always look forwards. And Michel Lafarge also would be somebody who, even at age 90, he was still looking to the future, and he would remember back to the past, maybe to describe a new vintage in terms of what the old ones were like. But he was never wound up in, it used to be better in the past, or the young today . And I think that's so valuable, and it kept him full of enthusiasm right up until his last week or so.
Okay, let's change gears slightly here then, Jasper, because I think we're certainly, I think, uncovering the time period that you were in, and maybe there in essence with the rise of the Primeur, and as you say, with some exchange rate favor, this has presumably been quite good for business.
Yes, that period was
the
good.
next
I founded our company, Morris & Verdin, in 1981. Sort of 20 years later, it was beginning to, management was maybe getting out of control because, I was completely untrained in that area. Tony Verdin had run several businesses, and so he was able to help me a great deal in the early days. But everything was done really by sort of seat of my pants. And there comes a moment, and by this stage we were employing quite a few people, and it needed professional management, and it was showing. So we had to make a decision as to, we came up with several plans of directions we might go in. And I got a telephone call from somebody at Berry Brothers and Rudd. Of course, I knew the company quite well as one of the longest established UK merchants. And indeed, one of their two bases is in Basingstoke, which is my hometown. So I think the first case of wine I ever bought for myself, I think have bought as an 18th birthday present from my parents, that was a case of port from Berries from the Basingstoke office. Anyway, on we go. So they made the call, and two things which they didn't really have was much expertise in Burgundy, and also their customer base was private customers, and we had a very good restaurant on-trade base, so we could bring the Burgundy and the on-trade. So it came at just the right time. Negotiations took a little while, but then it happened in late 2003, and in many ways it was a relief, because I think we'd done what we set out to do at Morris & Verdin, and it really needed a new impetus beyond my competencies to take it further. So I then stayed with them. Originally I was contracted, I needed to stay for a certain amount of time to make sure that the deal took, but I remained there until I hit 60 in 2017, and naturally had a great time. Our Burgundy side of things really did boom during that period. And I also got the opportunity to go out to Asia, because they had businesses in Hong Kong, then in Japan, then in Singapore. So I would go and talk Burgundy in those markets. And of course, it was fascinating to come to areas whose Burgundy journey was really only just beginning, and to try to explain what it was all about and get them enthused as well. Of course, now one wishes that maybe the whole world hadn't all fallen in love with Burgundy at the same time, because that's one of the triggers for prices having increased so much.
Yeah, and I think we will. Yeah, let's stick with your story really, and really, I think, kind of bring us right up to date, because again, I know that for a while you've been based in Burgundy. So yeah, I think maybe take us and through that period of then, okay, how do we get to you now, doing what you're doing now, and going it alone, basically?
Yes. So I did stay with Berries, and they were, they took me out of the chain of command, which absolutely suited me and suited them, and said, look, what we need you to be our Burgundy sort of guru, get the buying done, but also the promotion of the wines as well. But you can do it wherever you want to, from home in England or home in Burgundy. And my wife said she likes living in small places. Our village is now up to 240 people, and she's starting to make noises, and it's getting a bit crowded. But she definitely wasn't enjoying living in London. So in New Year '95, she said, "Okay, well, I'm gonna go live in the Burgundy house." And I went backwards and forwards, but building up more and more time in Burgundy. And because the wine world was changing, it was moving from what I set out to do, which was discover new producers and then find customers who wanted to buy the wines, put it on the correct margin, and off we go. It was coming to a question of Burgundy is now a big business. Some of the wines are trading hands at hugely inflated prices. We want you to go out and get allocations of these top domains if we haven't already got them, and then we will have the opportunity to bring in lots of money for the company. I don't get any real personal thrill out of doing that. So I could see that it was probably time to start thinking about, did I want to do one other thing while I still had energy? So at age 60, I did, handed in my notice to Berry Brothers, and took a year and a half or something to get it up and running, but started my website. Along the way, I had already written my Inside Burgundy book, and there's quite a nice story about how that happened, and a couple of insights which I think are worth sharing as well. So firstly, I wrote the book really for me, and I wrote it the way I wanted to write it, because I knew if I approached a publisher and said, I'd like to write a book about Burgundy because I think I know a bit about it now and we'd do a new one. They would have said, okay, fine, we agree with you, we think you can do it, and this is how we want you to do it. So I wanted to write it my way, which was less about the producer and much more about the land, all the different vineyards. Done profiles, all the Grand Crus, all the Primeur Crus, quite a few other vineyards. And then, of course, you've also got to talk about who's made the wines. So naturally, there were domain profiles too. Plus, I could do a nice bit on history and so on, all the rest of it, how the wines are made now and have been made differently over the years. So all that sort of came together. And I've sort of nearly written it in my spare time, weekends, evenings. And I mentioned to Simon Berry, my boss at Berry Brothers, I've sort of written this book on Burgundy. He said, who's publishing it? And I said, well, I haven't talked to a publisher yet. And he said instantly, this is really Simon Berry, instantly, we'll do it. So we launched an imprint, sort of Berry Brothers and Rudd Publishing. We turned everything on the head because we then employed some publishing professionals, Chris Folkes and Kerry Seagrove, to help us make it happen so that we were in control of the project. Because otherwise, I've talked to some other people who've written big books on wine, and the offers they've got from publishing houses have been derisory. And we also thought that the standard way of book publishing, the distribution of the books, doesn't really work either. Nowadays, you basically, the books get sold to a clearinghouse, or at least it's managed by a clearinghouse, and any bookshop will order up 1 or 2 copies, and then maybe if it hasn't sold, we'll send them back later on. And it's very cumbersome, takes a long time for it all to happen. So we thought we'd go a different route, which was, who's going to pay money for a book about expensive wine? Well, people who buy those expensive wines. So we found distribution partners. Obviously, the UK was done by Berry Brothers, but elsewhere around the world, we found distribution partners of professional wine people who would then take books by the pallet load, if not several pallets. I think quite a few pallets of the first edition went off to my friend in Norway, who did a brilliant job with them, and so on. It was terrific, and it meant that we sold what was regarded as a very high number of copies for a book of that size and sort. So I was very happy with that. And I definitely also thought that it was a big step up as to how I was viewed in the industry as a whole. I could feel my reputation building on the back of that book.
And again, this was while you were still at Berry's, and
first edition came out in 2010.
I mean, again, it sounded as though that, the way you've described it there, that initial conversation at least was very quick. We'll do it.
Yeah.
We want to kind of want a piece of this. Do you think that there was also an element of, even I know the sales, no one's going to turn down money and say that a book that's worth a lot and is selling a lot isn't not going to be insignificant. But was there also a sort of I guess an ROI type calculation just around effectively, was this doing for Burgundy, and was this, again, I guess by association, doing also for Berry Brothers?
Yes.
Kind of the role that you were doing. It was you in a paper form, but going off and being an ambassador,
and good for Berry Brothers because it was sort of Berry's homemade expert, as it were.
Yeah.
And I took a lot of care to make sure that there wasn't a conflict of interest, and I wrote some paragraphs about that in the book to explain how I'd approached the whole thing. And also because no domains were getting, or individual wines were getting rated in it, scored in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, and everybody, I think, took that on board, and I know I've had positive feedback on that conflict of interest question from all but one person who should be nameless, but otherwise people have taken it on board, and I think I've been trusted in that respect. But yes, it was good. I did a deal with Berry's, a unique one-off deal, and that I offered to pay half the losses if it lost money, but I wanted a good proportion of the profits if it made money, and happily it did make money. So it was a win-win-win, and subsequently, Berry's had expanded in lots of different directions, and the moment came we thought, no, we've got to get back to our core business, and they said publishing isn't our core business, and it meant that for marketing things and various other aspects of it, they were having to get people to do something which wasn't part of their normal skill set. So they said, look, we think the time has come that we'd like you to take back sort of control of it. And so it's now part of my sort of JMIB, Jasper Morris Inside Burgundy, general business.
Got you. And again, picking up the story, it was then, as you say, as you'd left Berries and you were now full time in Burgundy. Talk to us about the website integration between the website and the book. Actually, they do quite different things.
They do, absolutely, because the book has one image. Sort of after the title page, there is one picture in the whole book, and the second edition is at 800 pages. It's a big book. There's not a single tasting note either, so it's all about the background, the understanding. I mean, it's a textbook effectively, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And obviously, people actually want to know what individual wines taste like. And these days, you sort of have to give them scores out of 100, which I don't especially enjoy doing, but is a necessary part of it. So I started out difficult in the early days because I think if you're going to subscribe to a website like that, you actually want to have real depth of information on it. And of course, I didn't have loads of background tasting notes. And I mean, the ones that you would write for the annual offer for Berry Brothers are going to be phrased in a different way to the way that the critic is going to write them. And obviously I wouldn't have had scores, and it just didn't feel appropriate to go back and use those. So it took a little bit of time to build up a backlog of tasting notes. And then I thought the problem with Burgundy and scores is that it's not like Bordeaux, where you go to a chateau and you taste the Grand Vin and you taste the second wine. In Burgundy, you go along and you taste a Bourgogne Rouge, a Cotenue Village, a Gevrey Chambertin with a named vineyard, 3 Primeur Crus, perhaps in ascending order of quality, 2 or 3 Grand Crus, also in ascending order of quality. So you might end up tasting 12 or 15 wines at the domain. And inevitably, a producer in a certain vintage, normally the wines have got the same comparable quality across the range. And yes, they do go up in how good they are according to the quality of the vineyard. So you end up inevitably starting at sort of somewhere in the mid-80s and finishing, if it's really good, somewhere in the high 90s. Then nobody cares about a score that isn't into at least the mid-90s. So I had to find another way to give value. And I developed something which I haven't seen elsewhere. So as well as scores out of 100, I gave stars out of 5. And the stars out of 5 are how good is this wine within its class, its peer group. So a Bourgogne Rouge at 89, 90 points is an absolutely brilliant Bourgogne Rouge. But a Grand Cru at 89 points is frankly a poor one. So my Bourgogne Rouge at 90 is going to get 5 stars, and that gives it a chance to shine separately from, I don't know, a fairly good Primeur Cru and certainly a disappointing Grand Cru. So we found a second way, a new way of doing things, and it has clearly been well received.
Again, was that one of the first sites to try to do that for Burgundy? And even one of the
other people have found different ways of trying to highlight wines separate from the score, but I don't know any other website that does the same as what I'm doing.
In and of its time, I mean, there's tasting notes there. It sounds as though it's still relatively kind of text heavy, let's say. I mean, I know you've spoken about the book being the kind of textbook, but this is this is building a database effectively, as opposed to
building a database, and so you can go in and check out on any wine. I could have a look even while we're talking and give you the current score of where we are. So since we started in 2018, so we've been going there for six and a quarter years, and I have done in that time 270 tasting reports, which is 35,548 tasting notes, 54 podcasts, etc. And
you've got podcasts on the site, okay?
What's that?
You've got podcasts on the site as well.
We do, which are sort of informal. They're not professional ones in the way that you do it, but if we've been having an online tasting, for example, with me at one end of a Zoom call and the people tasting wine at the other end, we actually record that and then it turns up as a podcast. So those are normally about single producers, and I often do those in the company of the winemaker. So I might be at the domain with the winemaker and me talking to a group of people usually in Hong Kong, and the interaction between me and a winemaker makes it better than me on my own, and sometimes you sort of drone on in a teaching mode. Winemaker on their own, they start getting into a sales mode, and they, all the wines are wonderful. But the two of us together can really interact nicely.
Yeah, I absolutely love it, and I really think I wish there were a lot more podcasts, a lot more recordings. I think that was again, I think when we start into wine or we go into a new area of wine, I think we always have a sort of ideas, and we see things, and we want to challenge them, and we sometimes just forget about those challenges. But I really I've always believed that there's so much that happens almost behind closed doors in wine, and that that example there, might be a good one. It may have been that, okay, you're giving this tasting for this group there, and that could be just a very enjoyable private experience for them. But again, why not record it? Why not have that be on record, and why not have that be able to listen to by people
Absolutely.
all over the world?
And I think there is a value. People do get enjoyment out of things which have that slightly greater feeling of informality. I think works well. But anyway, you're the professional, not me in this area. And I've just, frankly, throughout my career, I've just whenever I've seen a way to do something, I've gone ahead and done it without worrying if it was the officially approved textbook way of going about setting up a company, setting up a website, doing any of these things, writing a book. I've tended to do the thing which I know is going to work for my temperament and all my skills, and also will keep me enthused and interested as I go along, which I think is always really important to maintain that interest.
Yeah, and I think what's really great about that is that I think if you actually, so something that I look at a lot, Jasper, is of course, I think we all in wine, we're all sort of looking at the next generation, as you've I think rightly pointed out before. There's always a next generation kind of coming through, isn't it? It can sort of get a little bit difficult to sort of draw a line and decide when the next generation. But there is a general feeling that younger people and people in general perhaps aren't drinking as much as they once were, and aren't drinking as much wine as they once were. I've always thought that it's so interesting to look at something that I call wine consumption. Okay, we know what's going on here, but then I've always looked at content consumption, to get a feel of how are people spending their time. And I've always just found it so fascinating that the audiences that are growing the fastest through audio and primarily through podcasts are actually the exact audiences that wine is sort of looking for. They're the youngest, right. They're the most affluent, the most educated. And actually the podcast boom has been led by English speaking markets. So it's been led by the States and Canada and the UK and even like Scandinavia, because why not? It's just, I think what you're doing there has got an audience. I think just in terms of a piece of kind of art in itself.
Audio is you can listen to it while you're doing something else. In the car or doing some task that requires a little bit of your attention, but not all of it. And it's why I've never been a television watcher. I listen to radio on that and that, plus other forms of streaming, simply because you can do something else at the same time. The idea of sitting down in front of a screen seems to me to be largely a waste of time.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And actually, I think it actually goes against the narrative that I think a lot of us have, which is that younger people now that they were born with the internet, they were kind of born with smartphones in their hands growing up, and actually a lot of them, I think, they have screen fatigue, and they just think I want something that's just as analog as you can. I still want it to be on demand. I still want it to be through my phone, and I don't want to miss out on anything that's coming in through my phone, but I want that kind of more raw and just really a long way of saying kudos to you for taking that step and releasing those, which presumably are also then a part of the subscription when people sign up to the website. Or
actually, you get that those podcasts are on the free to view or free to listen to part. The things which are behind the paywall are if you want the detailed tasting notes and the scores and the things that will help you choose which wines you're going to buy. There, I think it's reasonable to expect people to pay for that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the more generalized things, then no, they're outside. People can look at. And in fact, we got onto this subject. You asked me the question about whether it's sort of text heavy, but the wine tasting notes, they come out as reports, and the reports have a few pleasingly amateur images with them, which I take on my phone when I'm tasting in a cellar or if I walk in the vineyards or something like that.
Yeah, I do always have a lot of respect, I think for businesses and sectors where, as you say there, it's just, you take your phone out and click it, and, people, they recognize the value and they, recognize, I think, the experience.
And you do actually end up...
It's not about... sorry, go ahead.
I mean, there are quite a few reports where the images are frankly, obviously not really up to standard. And then others where by luck, I get an extraordinary picture, which one would never have got if one had sort of tried to do it more formally with the producer, and they would have been sitting there with cheesy smiles on their faces. But just occasionally, you catch somebody when you really do feel the character of the person as well as what they look like. If you're just taking a few random images. But there are others amongst my wine writing colleagues who are far, far better photographers, and I'm sure that's extremely valuable for their products.
Yeah. And I think, as we really, look to, I think, heading into the home straight really of our conversation today, Jasper, I know that when we talk about things like purpose. We think about the impact that you want to make on the world. I mean, you've told me that it's really around spreading the word around Burgundy, communicating about Burgundy, and what does that mean for you now? Because I mean, I think it's very interesting. Through our conversation, you've really kind of taken us through various phases of the development of the market and the reception of Burgundy internationally, and the growth of the market. So what sort of stage are we at now? And where do you sort of see your role in that in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, let's say?
Well, one thing which I need to do is start thinking about a succession plan because I'm not getting any younger, obviously. I still have all the enthusiasm, but it probably starts to take me a little bit longer to sort of write up all the reports. And I have got a workload which is a little bit unrealistic at the moment. And is growing, but I absolutely love what I do, and I think that's been the key through my career. I wasn't somebody who started out originally saying, right, this is where I want to get to for a fulfilled career. I just thought, oh, this is good. Someone's paying me to taste a bit of wine, and then it developed on from there, and so on and so forth. And I keep finding new aspects of it, which I love. And it's been great to see how Pinot in particular, but Chardonnay too, have been developing in countries that were only just starting out when I was starting out. New Zealand is one which I feel very close to, but Australia too, California, Oregon, and so on and so forth. Seeing what people are trying to do now in Japan and also in China. I mean, always looking forward. There are constantly things to keep me excited. So what I'm trying to do at the moment in terms of the website, in some ways the book is sort of morphing onto the website. A lot of the text can go onto it, but I want to keep trying to refine the quality of the offer, what we're doing, broaden it a bit. I now also have a contributor, one from New Zealand and one from Australia. Jane Skilton used to work for me in London before she moved out to Australia. She's also a master of wine. And then Tom Klein, a very engaging chap from Australia. So that's all going well. And we should add to that other Pinot and Chardonnay producing regions or countries, which indeed we will do. So there is lots more to develop. But I really do it for the love of it, and knowing that if you do a good job with something, then you're going to earn some money. I'm not trying to maximize the returns, but my life is sort of paid for now, and it's earning a reasonable amount of money, so that's good. But I really, really love being in the cellars with the producers. It's the engagement. Many wine reviews will send out sort of a call for samples, and we'll just be tasting the wines mechanically in a tasting room. And that doesn't enthuse me at all. I really want to, while I'm tasting the wine with a producer, I want to know what's going on in their mind and get the feeling of why the wines have come out the way they have through the character of the producer, through how they have lived through a given vintage, and obviously through what any individual terroir can pour into the mix. So more of the same. There's still way more that I would like to cover that I haven't got time to cover. So I think the site will evolve with additional contributors, including in Burgundy, and then I will slightly more pick and choose what areas I think I can cover in a more sensible time frame.
Yeah, it very much sounds term that I hear a lot of entrepreneurs that I follow online using, which is the infinite game. It sounds as though you being there, you getting to know, as I'm sure you have, the place, the people, the culture. I'm sure you've gone so far down the rabbit hole there that if you could start a new project every day of the week, and you're in it, aren't you? These people, I'm sure, are now your friends, they're colleagues, they're neighbors. They kind of you've now interwoven yourself into the fabric there, and it's just as you say. I think you're in a the position of your own building. All of what you described today, all of that work that's gone on in the past has led to you being in that I think quite positive position, let's say.
And if I go back to a bit of advice that Harry Wall gave me in probably about 1979, he said it's all about earning respect, and that if you sell some wine to somebody, if you bump into them in the street, you want for them to approach you with a big smile on their face and to say thank you for the wine that you sold me, or in my case now with what I'm doing, the wine that you've introduced me to, the producer you've introduced me to. And you need to gain respect, and then you need to make sure that you maintain it. You never stop. You should, as soon as you think you've got it all sorted, then that's when quality starts to go down.
I love it. So Jasper, it's been an absolute pleasure, but I would love to really thank you, and I'd love to share your coordinates really, and let our listeners know kind of where they can track you down and where they can learn more about
Absolutely.
your two main
We'll always
projects.
use more subscribers, and our partner's selling the book, and I'm sure use some more orders as well. So thank you for that, Lawrence, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you about my favourite subject.
Absolutely. So, and just to get it out there, it's insideburgundy.com is the website,
right.
and the book Inside Burgundy.
Yes. And
what is the latest edition that we have?
So we did a second edition in 2021, and we decided not to publish it in China. Sorry, not publish it, print it in China. We decided to print it in Italy. We thought it'd be more convenient. And the people who were doing it were based just outside Milan. And if you take yourself back to the very beginnings of COVID, Milan was where it all sort of blew up. And we just got it out on about the last day that they could still work in the factory before their first lockdown. We just got the book out in time. And the other thing about COVID means that I couldn't go around the world signing endless copies, or at least we hoped endless copies. So it took that load off. But the second edition has also been very well received, and it is a significant change from the first. Lots more information in it.
A huge thank you to today's guest, Jasper Morris, Master of Wine. Visit InsideBurgundy.com, the link is below, to explore the web portal described in this episode. And the second edition of Jasper's book, Inside Burgundy, is also available wherever you get your books. Next time on Interpreting Wine, in episode 587, I'll be speaking with Rachel Clausen of Barrel Room Media, where we take a deep dive into all things wine marketing. This transatlantic episode is not to be missed. So make sure you subscribe to be alerted when that episode goes live. See you then.